The telegram that arrived in Moscow in December 1949 carried congratulations from Mao Zedong on Stalin's 70th birthday, yet the Soviet dictator kept the Chinese communist leader waiting in the freezing capital for 9 agonizing weeks before granting him meaningful negotiations. After decades of uneasy cooperation and bloody misunderstandings between the Soviet Union and Chinese communists, Stalin finally held all the cards while Mao desperately needed recognition, military aid, and economic support to consolidate his infant People's Republic. But what did Stalin truly think of the man who had just delivered the world's most populous nation to communism against Moscow's explicit advice and contrary to every strategic calculation the Soviet leadership had made about China's future? The story begins not in 1949, but in the wreckage of 1927, when Stalin's disastrous China policy resulted in the near annihilation of the Chinese Communist Party. Stalin had ordered the Chinese Communists to maintain their alliance with Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalists, even as Chiang prepared to turn on them. The purge in Shanghai that April saw thousands of communists executed in the streets, their blood literally running in the gutters while Soviet advisors scrambled to evacuate. Stalin needed a scapegoat, and he found one in Leon Trotsky, whom he accused of sabotaging the China policy, but the failure was Stalin's alone. From that moment forward, Stalin regarded Chinese communism with suspicion, viewing it as a movement that had survived despite Moscow's guidance rather than because of it. Mao Zedong emerged from the southern mountains as a peasant organizer who violated every Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy about the urban proletariat leading revolution, and this fundamental heresy colored every subsequent interaction between the two men. Throughout the 1930s, Stalin barely knew who Mao was. The Soviet Union funneled support to other Chinese communist leaders, men who had trained in Moscow and spoke the proper ideological language. Wang Ming, a Stalin favorite who had spent years in the Soviet capital, represented the kind of compliant, Moscow-oriented communist that Stalin preferred. When Wang Ming parachuted into the communist base areas with instructions from Moscow, Mao systematically outmaneuvered him, consolidating power through a combination of military success against the Japanese and brutal internal purges that mirrored Stalin's own methods. Stalin noticed this, and while he might have appreciated the ruthlessness, he deeply distrusted any communist leader who operated independently of Soviet control. If you find yourself drawn to understanding the hidden mechanisms and personal calculations that shaped Cold War history, the unspoken rivalries and institutional paranoia that determined which version of communism would dominate Eurasia, subscribe now, because we excavate exactly these fault lines that textbooks smooth over. The Second World War complicated everything. Stalin needed Japan pinned down in China, which gave the Chinese communists sudden strategic value. Yet he maintained official diplomatic relations with Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government throughout the war. Soviet military aid flowed to Chongqing, not to Yan'an, where Mao commanded his guerrilla armies. American journalists who visited Mao's base area in 1944 found a disciplined, ideologically coherent movement that impressed them more than the corrupt nationalist regime, but Stalin read these reports with skepticism bordering on contempt. He understood that Mao had built something formidable, but formidable did not mean loyal, and loyalty to Moscow mattered more to Stalin than revolutionary success in distant provinces. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Stalin faced a critical choice about China's future, and his decision revealed the depth of his doubt about Mao's prospects and perhaps his true feelings about the Chinese revolutionaries' capabilities. Stalin ordered Soviet troops occupying Manchuria to strip the region's industrial equipment and ship it back to the Soviet Union. The same predatory policy applied to Eastern Europe. Simultaneously, he signed a treaty of friendship with Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government, explicitly recognizing it as China's legitimate authority. Soviet forces even handed over some former Japanese weapons to Chinese communist forces in Manchuria, but this was tactical opportunism rather than genuine support. Stalin told Yugoslav and Polish communist delegations in 1948 that he had advised Mao to compromise with Chiang Kai-shek to join a coalition government and avoid civil war because he believed the Chinese communists would be crushed in an all-out conflict. This was not modesty or caution, but a fundamental assessment that Mao's peasant army could not defeat American-backed nationalist forces equipped with modern weapons. Stalin was preparing for Mao to fail, and he did not want Soviet prestige tied to a losing cause in Asia. Mao ignored Moscow's advice. The Chinese Civil War erupted in full fury in 1946, and against every prediction, against Stalin's own strategic calculations, the communist forces began winning. They employed mobile warfare, concentrated superior numbers at decisive points, captured American weapons from retreating nationalist armies, and converted entire enemy divisions to their cause. By 1948, the Communists controlled Manchuria and were pushing south of the Great Wall toward the Yangtze River. Stalin watched this unfold with what we can only describe as astonishment mixed with unease. Every victory Mao achieved without Soviet help was proof that Chinese communism could succeed independently, which meant it might operate independently afterward. The specter that haunted Stalin was not American capitalism but uncontrolled communism, movements that claimed Marxist-Leninist legitimacy while refusing subordination to Moscow's directives. Soviet intelligence archives reveal that Stalin maintained contact with Mao throughout the Civil War, but offered remarkably little material support compared to what the USSR provided to Eastern European Communist parties. The tonnage of weapons, vehicles, and supplies shipped to Poland, Czechoslovakia, or East Germany dwarfed anything sent to China. Some historians argue Stalin was constrained by logistics, the vast distances and poor infrastructure making large-scale aid impossible. But this ignores the fact that Stalin had just supplied a massive army in Manchuria. The truth appears simpler and more psychological. Stalin did not want to invest heavily in what he expected to be a failure, and even as Mao's victories accumulated, Stalin hesitated to fully commit because success meant dealing with a powerful, independent-minded communist neighbor. When Mao proclaimed the People's Republic of China on October 1, 1949, standing atop Tiananmen Gate and announcing that the Chinese people had stood up, Stalin sent formal congratulations but privately told Khrushchev and other Politburo members that Mao was a margarine Marxist whose communism was superficial and nationalist at its core. This phrase, documented in several Soviet memoirs, encapsulates Stalin's contempt. Margarine was a cheap substitute for butter, an inferior imitation of the real thing, and calling Mao's Marxism margarine implied that Chinese communism lacked authenticity, that it was peasant nationalism wearing revolutionary language as camouflage. Stalin had spent decades building a specific model of communism centered on heavy industry, urban workers, and absolute party control directed from Moscow. Mao represented a different path entirely, one rooted in rural rebellion, land redistribution, and mass mobilization techniques that owed more to Chinese historical precedents than to anything Lenin or Stalin had written. The December 1949 visit to Moscow forced both men into direct confrontation. Mao arrived by train, spending 9 days crossing Siberia, arriving in the Soviet capital as a supplicant despite having just conquered the world's most populous country. Stalin kept him isolated in a dacha outside Moscow, providing luxurious accommodations but no substantive meetings. Days passed, then weeks. Mao celebrated his 56th birthday in isolation while Stalin attended to other matters. This was psychological warfare of the subtlest kind, establishing hierarchy without explicit insult, demonstrating that despite Mao's military triumph, Stalin controlled access to the international communist movement's inner sanctum. Mao could not afford to leave without a treaty, without military guarantees and economic aid, so he endured the humiliation while his frustration built to dangerous levels. When negotiations finally began in January 1950, the dynamics were poisonous. Stalin wanted to preserve Soviet privileges in Manchuria, maintain control over the Chinese Eastern Railway, and ensure Soviet access to Port Arthur and Daren, the warm-water ports that had been Russian strategic objectives since Tsarist times. These were exactly the kind of unequal concessions that imperialist powers had extracted from weak Chinese governments, and Mao had not fought for 22 years to replace Western imperialism with Soviet imperialism. But he needed Stalin's nuclear umbrella, his advanced weapons, his industrial expertise to build China's shattered economy. The treaty signed on February 14, 1950, represented a compromise that satisfied neither man. Stalin agreed to return the railway and ports, but only after lengthy transition periods. The Soviet Union committed to $300 million in loans over 5 years, a paltry sum compared to what the United States was pouring into Western Europe through the Marshall Plan, barely $10 per Chinese citizen. Stalin's stinginess spoke volumes. He provided East Germany with more per capita assistance than China, which tells us that he valued a divided Germany more than a united China as a Cold War asset. The industrial equipment that arrived in China under the treaty consisted largely of outdated machinery, second-generation technology that kept China dependent on Soviet expertise without transferring cutting-edge capabilities. Mao recognized this immediately, but had no choice except to accept because the alternative was isolation. The Korean War, erupting just 4 months after Mao left Moscow, forced a different dynamic entirely. Stalin orchestrated the Korean War with remarkable cynicism, encouraging Kim Il-sung to invade South Korea while ensuring Soviet forces would not directly engage American troops. When the war went badly and Chinese intervention became necessary to save the North Korean regime, Stalin pushed Mao to commit Chinese troops while promising air support that materialized slowly and inadequately. Chinese soldiers died in human wave attacks against American firepower, while Soviet pilots flew limited missions under strict rules of engagement designed to avoid direct Soviet-American combat. Stalin was testing Mao, using Chinese blood to bog down American forces in Asia, and Mao understood this perfectly. The war killed hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers, including Mao's own son Enying, who died in an American airstrike in November 1950. Stalin sent condolences but continued to charge China for Soviet weapons used in Korea, a brutal reminder that communist solidarity had strict financial limits. What did Stalin really think of Mao during these Korean War years, the final phase of their relationship before Stalin's death in March 1953? Soviet documents reveal a mixture of grudging respect for Mao's ruthlessness and persistent contempt for what Stalin viewed as Chinese backwardness. Stalin appreciated that Mao shared his willingness to sacrifice millions for strategic objectives, that he understood political power flowed from violence and fear, that he conducted internal purges with appropriate thoroughness. But Stalin never viewed Mao as an intellectual equal. In conversations with Eastern European leaders, Stalin referred to Chinese communists as radish communists, red on the outside but white inside, implying that their communism was superficial, that nationalism and traditional Chinese authoritarianism drove their politics rather than genuine Marxist-Leninist conviction. This assessment was partially correct, but fundamentally missed what made Mao dangerous to Stalin's vision of communist unity. Mao was indeed adapting communism to Chinese conditions in ways that violated Soviet orthodoxy, but he was also creating a revolutionary model that could appeal to the colonized world in ways Soviet communism could not. Stalin had built socialism in one country through forced industrialization and collectivization, methods that required existing industrial infrastructure and literate urban populations. Mao was demonstrating that peasant societies could make communist revolutions through protracted guerrilla warfare and land reform, offering a template for Asia, Africa, and Latin America that bypassed the Soviet model entirely. Stalin recognized this threat implicitly, which explains his determination to keep China subordinate and dependent rather than embracing it as a genuine partner. The economic relationship reinforced these patterns. Soviet advisors in China during Stalin's final years reported back to Moscow with barely concealed disdain for Chinese technical capabilities, administrative chaos, and ideological deviations. These reports went directly to Stalin, who annotated them with sarcastic marginalia. When Chinese officials requested more generous loan terms or advanced technology transfers, Stalin's refusals were curt and non-negotiable. He treated China as a junior partner at best, a liability at worst, never as the ally that China's size and revolutionary success should have warranted. Compare this to Stalin's treatment of tiny Albania, which received disproportionate Soviet attention simply because its loyalty to Moscow was unquestioned. Stalin valued obedience over capability, ideological submission over strategic weight. The personal dimension mattered as well. Stalin and Mao met face-to-face only during the 1949 to 1950 Moscow visit, a handful of meetings over several weeks, and the chemistry was terrible. Stalin at 70 was paranoid, physically declining, presiding over a gerontocratic system through terror and bureaucratic manipulation. Mao at 56 was vigorous, fresh from military victory, accustomed to commanding through charismatic authority and ideological debate within the party leadership. Their conversational styles clashed fundamentally. Stalin spoke in short, declarative sentences, often ending discussions by simply walking out. Mao preferred long, discursive explanations, drawing on Chinese classical literature and philosophy, references that meant nothing to Stalin and probably struck him as pretentious time-wasting. Interpreters struggled to convey not just words, but entire frameworks of thought that had no overlap. Stalin's death in March 1953 freed Mao from a relationship that had always been more constraining than supportive. The relief in Beijing was palpable despite the official mourning. Within months, Mao was pushing boundaries Stalin would never have tolerated, asserting Chinese positions on international communist movement questions, developing independent relationships with other Asian communist parties, and beginning to articulate a distinct Chinese revolutionary path. Khrushchev's subsequent attempts to repair Sino-Soviet relations foundered partly because Stalin had poisoned the well so thoroughly, establishing patterns of Russian condescension and Chinese resentment that proved impossible to overcome. The Sino-Soviet split of the early 1960s, which shattered international communist unity and realigned global Cold War dynamics, had its roots in Stalin's fundamental inability to accept Mao as anything other than a peripheral, suspect figure whose success was an anomaly rather than a validation. What larger truth emerges from examining Stalin's view of Mao? The relationship reveals how ideology, even totalizing ideology like Marxism-Leninism, cannot overcome nationalism, cultural prejudice, and personal psychology. Stalin genuinely believed in communist internationalism as a concept, but he defined it as obedience to Moscow, as replication of Soviet models, as subordination of national interests to Soviet strategic needs. Any deviation represented heresy or opportunism. Mao arrived at communism through different experiences, Chinese rather than Russian, peasant rather than proletarian, and Stalin could never fully accept this alternative path as legitimate. The tragedy, if we can use that word for a relationship between two of history's deadliest dictators, was that a genuine Sino-Soviet alliance based on mutual respect might have permanently altered the Cold War balance, but Stalin's contempt made such an alliance impossible. The parallels to contemporary geopolitics are striking. Great powers consistently underestimate rising powers, viewing them through frameworks built on past experiences rather than present realities. Stalin expected Mao to fail because peasant armies had never defeated modern conventional forces in Marxist theory. When Mao succeeded anyway, Stalin could not adjust his assessment, could not grant China the status its achievement warranted, because doing so would undermine his entire worldview about how communist revolutions should unfold. Today's established powers make similar mistakes, projecting their assumptions onto rising nations, dismissing alternative development models as inferior or unsustainable, then acting surprised when history refuses to follow the predicted script. Stalin thought Mao was margarine communism, a cheap imitation that would melt under pressure, but Mao's revolution outlasted Stalin's empire and continues to shape global politics 7 decades later, which suggests that Stalin fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the challenge Chinese communism posed to Soviet hegemony and perhaps to communism itself.